Welcome everyone to this very first ICES webinar. So we have been looking very much forward to welcome you today to this webinar about the impact of COVID-19. My name is Astrid Haug. I will be today's moderator. I'm located in Copenhagen, but we actually do have people from 55 different countries joining us today. And we have over 700 registered participants. We'll see how many are joining today, but at least there's a lot of interest for this topic and for today's webinar. So that's very great. And you can see on this map what countries are joining us, and also a bit of statistics about the participants for today. So we have a lot of natural scientists, we have a lot of academia and research, and we have more female than male. Also we have more people joining ICES event for the first time. So welcome to all of you, both the new ones and the old ones, the ones who've been here before. There we go. Yeah. So just once again, welcome everyone. I'm Astrid Haug, joining this webinar from Copenhagen. I'll be the moderator, and we are about to get ready. But just before we start, there's just a few rules on how we do this webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the questions box to your right. We won't use the raise hand, or we won't use the chat, so just ask your questions. Also, if you do have any technical questions, please feel free to put them in the questions box, and some people here with ICES will get back to you on the technical questions. Feel free to ask questions throughout the whole webinar as soon as we get the speakers on. The sooner you ask the questions, the more likely it is that we'll actually get a chance to answer it today. If we won't be able to answer all your questions, we will take some of the most asked questions and answer them on the ICES webpage. You will also be able to get the slides from today on the webpage, as well as the recording from today's webinar as well. So just a few words about how this webinar is going to work. There's a small orange arrow, and you can press that arrow so you get a full screen view, so you don't have to see all the things on the right side. You can also press there's a small square with an arrow on the right side of the questions box, so you can pop out that box if you want to see that, even though you don't see the whole panel to the right. Yeah, I think that's about it. I just want to remind you, please feel free also to use the hashtag ICES Reflections. And you can use that, of course, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, wherever you are on social media. Please feel free to use the hashtag ICES Reflections. Today's program, we have 4 speakers. It's 4 pre-recorded presentations, because we want to make sure they stay in the right time amount. But then we have a live Q&A, and after the 4 presentations and the Q&A, we'll have a panel with all 4 speakers. So again, please feel free to ask questions throughout the whole webinar. You might experience a small glimpse of black screen when we switch from video to live cameras, but don't worry, we got everything under control here. It's just that if you think that something's going wrong with your screen, it's not. It's just the small switch we need to make between the videos and the live sessions. So before we start with the first speaker, we would like to know a bit about you. So we have a small poll for you that should pop up on the screen just in a second. There we go. So are you working on the effects of COVID-19 on fisheries? And just put in your answer. There we go. We got the answers here. So most people are working on the impacts on fishers, and then on the social socioeconomic aspects, and then on other topics, and over half of you, none of these. So, but I hope it will still be relevant for you. But it's good to know we have a kind of a mixed audience today, a lot of different aspects towards this topic. So that's going to be very interesting, I think. So we're going to be ready now for the first video, the first presentation by Alan Haynie from the US. He's working with PICES as chair of SIHD. So please welcome to Alan's video.
Hi, I'm Alan Haynie from NOAA Fisheries in the United States. I'm the chair of the IC's Strategic Initiative on the Human Dimension. And before my colleagues tell you about their COVID-related work, I'm going to talk a little bit of the types of things we've been doing in the Strategic Initiative to better incorporate social science throughout ICs. I first came to ICs at the annual science conference in 2009 in Berlin, and I was warmly welcomed. Wow, you're an economist. But I was also asked, why are you here? And at that point, ICs had not fully embraced the idea that social science should be central to its mission. Today, social science is a central component of the IC's vision. People in the natural environment are both part of the ecosystem, and good natural science and social science are what will enable us to most effectively and sustainably manage our oceans. To make this interdisciplinary vision a reality, ICs created the Strategic Initiative on the Human Dimension in 2015. This group now involves more than 90 researchers from diverse disciplines, from economics to anthropology, from law to interdisciplinary science. SIHD has created a number of different working groups, as well as sponsoring diverse workshops and conferences and sessions in conferences to promote the better integration of social science through the marine science community. We are a strategic initiative, which means that we're not just a working group that works on our own, but we look at ways to try to incorporate social science throughout ICs where appropriate. This means that our mission is far from done, that who we are will continue to evolve as the questions that we face change. One way that we do this type of interdisciplinary work is through integrated ecosystem assessment groups, IEAs, that are a core part of the ICs community. Last year, we held a workshop, WKCONSERVE, where we brought a number of different social scientists and natural scientists together to try to recognize what are the exciting things that are happening now in these groups, and how could we increase the amount of social science in a way that would be beneficial to the groups and to the larger ICs community. Because so many of the questions that we work with are interdisciplinary, members of SIHD have worked to try to create an environment in which we can safely transcend the boundaries of specific disciplines. The MCs meeting held in 2016 and the one that has now been rescheduled for next year in Yokohama, Japan, are exciting forums where we're able to talk across disciplines and have really advanced the nature of marine science to go beyond being a biological science to being an interdisciplinary science that appropriately integrates across the disciplines. We also have worked a lot with our partners in the Strategic Initiative on Climate Change and ICs and PICES groups to try to look at the challenges that climate change is going to bring across all of the things that we do in managing marine resources. Going forward, SIHD is a very exciting way to work on some of the biggest questions that we face as a marine science community and as a society. We'll continue to work on coordinating, creating scientific work that's valuable to the larger marine science community, and working with stakeholders to better understand the needs of policymakers and resource users. This last piece is a really important part, and we're reaching out to those of you who are stakeholders saying we want to talk and understand what your priorities are. The more that we can understand what the goals are of potential management actions, the better we can collect data and do research that'll best address those questions and help us together build a better management system. Today, you'll see 3 exciting talks about COVID-19 research in North America and Europe. All of us in SIHD have been reacting to this crisis like all of you have. Many of us have worked with our national governments to try to understand the impacts of the crisis and reduce the pain that's suffered by the fishery participants who've been impacted by the crisis. We've learned a lot from this experience, Long-term relationships that social scientists have with fishing communities and their participants can be really important in understanding the actual specific impacts that different fisheries experience, as you'll hear today. Also, having long-term data, the ability to know what happened before, lets us understand the impacts of a crisis like this, or to understand how changes like climate change are going to impact our communities over time. We need more data, we need more research, and we invite you all to participate in increasing the amount of social science that's part of the ICES science community. If you have any questions about SIHD, feel free to email me or to reach out to others.
Thank you very much, Alan. The video, I think.
Okay.
There we go. So that was more than a glimpse. I think it ended a bit suddenly, but we're there and you are now with us live. Alan, thank you for that.
Hi, Astrid.
So
Thanks.
So one of the things that you said in your video was that we need more data. What kind of data are you thinking about and who should provide that data?
Yeah, thanks. As you know, a diverse group of scientists, we use a lot of economic data. We use social data. The WG social group that Cristina and Marloes are very active in has worked on both collecting human data, interviewing all sorts of participants to understand their experiences, and developing social indicators to see how communities are impacted and the dependence of the communities on fisheries and other resources. Economic data, we collect data throughout the economy of seafood and fisheries. So that means both looking at the specifics of the people, the participants in the fishery, how they're earning money and making choices to fish in different places, to participate or not. And then the wholesale markets and you know, to you and me when we go and either go to a restaurant or buy food in stores. And so putting all of those together lets us understand how policy is impacting the fishers and all of us. And then in the case of an experience like COVID, we can tell what the impacts are, and the governments can think about how to most appropriately react and benefit those and help those who've been impacted.
So during COVID-19, what kind of data would you have liked to have had that you didn't have at that time?
So one of the challenges that we have is we don't have consistent data throughout the countries, the different communities, and throughout all of these different levels of the economy. So it was hard to have a baseline all over the place to understand the relative impacts in different places. We have quite good information in certain sectors, but in other places we don't. Like in some cases we know some of the costs of different fisheries. In other cases we don't have a very good sense of what those are, or they may not be comparable across different scales of fisheries. Cristina is going to talk more about small scale fisheries and some information they have.
Another big topic you also mentioned in your video is natural disasters and climate change. So just a few words about what should be done in order to prepare for that.
I have a new paper out yesterday, actually, so you should read that paper.
I should have read it, yeah.
So we're trying really to do integrated modeling to look at the impacts. A lot of how fisheries management works is we collect data on the biological environment and some data on fishing, and then biologists make models to understand how much we can sustainably catch of different species. And this is a lot of these factors throughout the whole process of from oceanography to what's experienced by people at different seasons and different places. Fish are shifting across different areas. We have to consider the impacts of these changes, both on our historical data, so looking backwards to understand how that's being impacted, and going forwards to make our systems adaptive and resilient to the changes that are happening.
But it must be twofold. Like on the one hand, we of course want to preserve the fish, and the other hand, we want to preserve the fishers and make sure that they have a sustainable economy as well. How do you balance these two concerns?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's really central to what we do in SIHD, and in modern fisheries management, that's is our focus of recognizing that people are going to respond to a changing natural environment in all sorts of ways. They have flexibility to adapt in a way that's great, but then of course they're going to be challenged in new ways too. And we have the sustainability, of course, is central to this, but we also of course care about however we use those natural resources. We want to get the most benefits as we can for the fishers and for all of us.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. We'll get back to you in the panel at the end, but thank you so much for joining us for now. You'll stay tuned for a bit later, because now we're going to have the next video from from Doug Lipton. He's also from the States and from NOAA Fisheries. Yeah, we'll take the next video now from Doug Lipton.
Thanks for joining me. My name is Doug Lipton. I'm the Senior Research Scientist for Economics at NOAA Fisheries in the US. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of our experiences in the US with applying socioeconomic analysis to impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges we faced, some of the actions we took, and some of the lessons we've learned. I'm not going to talk today about what the impacts were. Focus today is on the process and the role that economics and social science can play in helping to deal with a crisis like this. Well, I said I wasn't going to talk about impacts. I just wanted to give you a feel for the magnitude. So in the US, about 65% of our seafood expenditures occur away from home, mostly at restaurants. And this chart here shows the huge decline in spending overall at restaurants in the US through the end of July. It might be helpful to use the analogy of a major hurricane moving at slow motion and trying to figure out where it's going to make landfall and what the impacts are going to be in the short and long run. Unfortunately, in the US, we have a bit of experience on our East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico in doing these types of rapid assessments of damages. So whether we're talking about a hurricane or COVID-19, there's usually an immediate need to get information about what's in its path or where the likely damages are to occur. So we need to get baseline information on activities so that we can get resources where they're needed right away. Then as more information becomes available over the coming months, we need to re-examine what the actual damages were and what the long-term impacts are going to be. And then over the years, we need to look at our policies and see how we can arm ourselves better so we can mitigate impacts of future disasters. So we embarked on 4 different activities to meet these different timeframe needs. I'm not going to talk about the research agenda, that's still unfolding. I will talk about our work on calculating baselines of the industry, doing industry snapshots, and developing scenarios. So one of the big drivers of the need for immediate information was the passage of the CARES Act. This was passed at the end of March and provided over $2 trillion in economic stimulus. So a lot of the general provisions of the act applied to industries of all types, and the marine and seafood businesses were potentially eligible. So fortunately, we had the National Sea Grant Law Center help us identify how seafood and marine businesses could take advantage of some of these provisions, such as the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a forgivable loan if a business kept employees on their payroll, whether or not you could apply for unemployment or special pandemic unemployment, which applied to independent contractors, which are the way fishing crews are normally paid. And the Sea Grant Law Center helped us figure out what provisions were applicable to the seafood industry and how they would work. And they held workshops and seminars in order to get that information out to the Sea Grant Network. For those of you who don't know, in the US, the Sea Grant Network is a partnership between the federal government, state governments, and universities to provide marine and coastal research and outreach to decision makers in the various states throughout the US. Now, in addition to those general provisions, there was a specific provision, a section that was specifically targeted to fishery participants. And this is where NOAA Fisheries came in helping to distribute about $300 million out to the US states to eligible participants. For the CARES Act, we had to develop baselines of what would be normal activity across a wide range of seafood and marine sectors. So within the seafood sector, we not only included capture fisheries, but also aquaculture. Aquaculture was a little bit challenging because the US Department of Agriculture also has responsibilities for aquaculture, but mostly freshwater aquaculture, whereas the marine aquaculture responsibility was given to NOAA Fisheries. There are tribal fisheries that have to be accounted for, the processing sector, and even imports when they're processed into value-added products counted. And then on the recreational side, I've mentioned earlier, the for-hire sector with charter boat fishermen and party boats also being eligible for CARES Act funding. And this all had to be done at the state level. So it was a big lift in terms of doing data analysis. So once we completed developing the baseline information for distribution of the $300 million from the CARES Act to the various states, we needed to determine what kinds of impacts we were actually seeing. Now, there were plenty of media and industry reports, but these are not typically representative of what's going on industry-wide. So where we were pre-authorized, and this pre-authorization came actually from our hurricane analogy, where we've been allowed to go and do short-term disaster evaluations, we were able to conduct formal surveys. In other areas on the West Coast, in Alaska and Hawaii, we had to rely more on key stakeholder interviews and representative data that way. And then for aquaculture, again, we partnered with our Sea Grant community. They conducted an aquaculture survey of both freshwater and marine aquaculture, and were able to provide us with information about impacts on that sector of the economy. The scenario analysis is the one activity I've been most involved in. So when this baseline information was being collected for the CARES Act, I started looking at it at a monthly basis and then started wondering, well, what's going to happen as the pandemic plays out? And so at the end of March, beginning of April, I started trying to put this data together. Of course, there wasn't really much data. We just had the news reports, as I was talking about. We hadn't yet had the snapshots. But I took the information that our regions were bringing forward and put it into a national model, and then just made guesses on the evolution of impacts, both on their severity, because we didn't have actual impacts at the time, and when things would likely return to normal. So at the time, my thinking was, well, is this going to be over in June or July? And is it going to linger a little bit, with a small impact throughout the remainder of the year? Now, as we're pulling together the data in September, first of all, we have some actual landings and revenue data in some of our fisheries, and not in all of them. So we have observed impacts. So we can see what the impacts are from the different levels of shutdowns. And we can now start to make more educated guesses on the severity of the impacts, as well as the time frame in which they're going to play out. So we're continuing to update these and look at what's at stake in the future if things continue the way they are or as they improve. I think we continue to face and meet a variety of challenges. So one is the different audiences that need our information, whether it's the industry or politicians and managers. And again, they need these at very different timescales. So we're doing a lot of things at once. We need systematic representative measures of impacts. What we have readily are media and industry reports. We need to rely on the economic data that is often lagged. I look with jealousy at the European Monitor for Fisheries and Aquaculture, which is able to produce weekly reports. We don't have that kind of public surveillance of our seafood and fishing industries in the US. And we face the challenge of assessing the damage while the quote hurricane is still going on. And the usual bureaucratic challenges, our ability to do surveys in areas where we don't have pre-authorization has been a challenge, getting data at the level we need it, and again, in a timely way. Anyway, I thank you for your time. Look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much, Doc.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hear me? I can hear you. So as I said in the very beginning, this is the first PICES webinar, so we're still working a bit on all the different buttons in this nice system. And on the technical side, a few of you complained about the sound in the videos. Unfortunately, it's a bit lower than the sound we have on now, and the only fix I can think of is that when the videos come on, you need to actively turn up the volume on your computer or smartphone. So we're sorry about that, but we hope that you will be able to hear some of it the next few videos. Thank you so much, Doc, for that introduction and that presentation. There's a lot of different things that we could dive into, but I'm just curious whether you see from the stakeholders that they are going to be more involved, like a different kind of involvement from stakeholders after the COVID-19?
That's a great question. The stakeholder role is evolving, and of course, when you say stakeholders, that's a broad array of interests. So the fishermen, the people involved in the fishing industry, their broader communities in which they live. So it's certainly going to be different. You know, they are evolving. You know, we see more direct sales to consumers, so that's a way of increased involvement by you know, the fishermen themselves taking on a different role than they normally do if they're selling directly to restaurants or directly to consumers. So there are going to be changing roles, and certainly any longer term actions that a federal government or state government takes is going to be better addressing the problem if it does engage stakeholders in determining what the action should be.
Okay, great. We have a few questions for you from the audience. We have one here from Astrid. What has been your collaboration with academic institutions during this time?
Yeah, it's been challenging to coordinate. It's you know, difficult in these times given the new way we do business. But with academic institutions, I mentioned a couple of times in my talk about the Sea Grant network. So those folks are part of the university system. They're again jointly funded with the federal government. So we've had good collaborations in some areas, as I mentioned, in aquaculture, where we were sure we were on the same page. In other areas, it's been a little more challenging, where everybody wants to get information from the different sectors. So we may be in the federal government out doing surveys and asking questions, and then a university researcher might be in that same community asking, you know, similar questions. And so then the stakeholders say, well, you know, why aren't you working and coordinating? You know, so I think, again, that's part of the problem of, you know, trying to ramp up things very quickly. But I think once we've learned what other folks are doing, there's been an attempt to be more coordinated and not overburden the folks that are impacted with having to answer whole lots of questions from different people that are asking basically similar or the same questions.
Okay, great, Doug. We have another question from Amina Tiforo. And the question is, what about IUU during the pandemic?
So that's a great question. And I think that, you know, I can only really speak from the US perspective where, you know, all the controls are in place and I think continue to be, you know, there are challenges with in fisheries where observers are required, that those observers be deployed, you know, so there are issues there. But in terms of policies or programs to, you know, prevent import of product, you know, and surveillance of that, I think those have continued. But I think as that's one of the items that are sort of more the intermediate time frame studies. I'm sure folks will be looking at that and seeing if there is evidence that IUU has become more prevalent during COVID or just what's happened.
Okay, we're just going to take one last question and then we'll have the rest of the questions during the panel. But a question here from Anam Mara Shaikh, who's asking how much is the amount impact on economies all over the world? So the global impact, economic impact. Do you know anything about that?
Wow, I haven't seen anybody, you know, do this sort of the whole global impact. And again, we're still trying to figure out the US impact. When I mentioned the CARES Act, what's at stake? The eligible participants in the CARES Act, the revenues that they receive are over $14 billion a year. So some percentage of that has been lost. And in some fisheries, it's been a high percent, and others, you know, they haven't been impacted that much, and even others have done better. But I think that's another wait and see in terms of what the global impacts are.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for now, Doc. You will join us later in the panel as well. We have two more presentations that we want to run, and the next one is from Marloes Kraan, and no, sorry, the next one is from Cristina Pita. Marloes is the last one. So Cristina Pita from University of Aveiro from Portugal, from the Center for Environmental and Marine Studies. So Cristina Pita's presentation will be on in a short while.
Hello, everybody. I will be presenting some preliminary results from a study about the impact of COVID-19 on small-scale fisheries in Europe. Small-scale fisheries are an important component of the European fisheries. They account for 82% of the fleet, 47% of employment, and 14% of the value of landings. They also provide EU markets with high-quality fresh products and are highly dependent on HoReCa channels for their survival. In order to investigate the impact of COVID-19 and the unprecedented lockdowns implemented to fight the pandemic, the impact they had on small-scale fisheries, we conducted a survey to collect information from representatives of small-scale fisheries organizations. It was a kind of an opportunistic sampling with interviews done over the phone. We asked them about, we had three main guiding questions. What was the social economic impact of COVID-19 on the activity of their associates, the impact on health and well-being, and which measures they adopted to face this crisis. The survey was conducted immediately after the lockdown was put in place, so we started in late March, early April, and it went up to June. We had replies from 105 organizations from 12 different EU countries. We asked specifically about economic loss, direct and indirect economic loss. They identified important losses in revenue, classifying it as a 7 on a scale of 1, no loss, to 10, very high loss. Specifically, they mentioned losses between 20 and 100% depending on the species. The loss was especially high in the north of Europe, with reported losses of 80 to 100% in the case of shellfish. Fishes targeting high-value species suffered quite an important economic loss. In terms of employment, the impact was not so high, with a classification of 4 out of 10. Some fishers were put on layoff. Some worked for less pay, up to 50% less pay, and some went on vacations. They pointed to the fact that small-scale fisheries are mostly a family business, hence the low loss of jobs. They also pointed to the fact that the industry is used to stop for long periods of time due to bad weather, especially in the winter. So this had an impact on the low loss of jobs. But that if the crisis continue over the summer period and over a long period of time, then potentially there would be some serious loss of jobs. Besides revenue and jobs, we also asked representatives of organizations to classify a series of drivers of social economic impact on a scale of 1 to 10. Not important at all to very important. We observed a difference in replies between northern and southern representatives of organizations. On the left we have the southern, and on the right we have the northern. Southern representatives consider the loss of usual customers, like restaurants, schools, etc., the loss of markets due to the absence of tourists, the decrease in prices, and the lack of buyers at auction as the main reasons for the social economic impact. While in the north, they consider decrease in prices, the loss of international markets, and the loss of markets due to the absence of tourism, as well as the loss of customers, the loss of HoReCa channels as the main reasons for the social economic impact. Looking at the top main reasons in detail, the loss of usual customers was connected to the closure of the HoReCa channels and the shift in consumer demand from fresh to frozen canned seafood, which was verified immediately in March in most European countries. The loss of markets due to the absence of tourism is connected to the previous closure of the food service industry. It was also pointed that the cancellation of seafood festivals over the summer could have a major impact on small-scale fisheries. The loss of international markets was a problem commonly mentioned by northern representatives, especially the loss of the Spanish, Italian, and French markets, which was some of the economies most affected by the lockdown with the strict lockdowns. And also the fact that the local buyers don't have the capacity to replace these international markets for small-scale fisheries products. The decrease in prices at auction, especially for luxury seafood, was pointed as a major problem for small-scale fisheries, with no one buying these products at auction. Impacts are not just social economic. We also asked about impacts on health and well-being. There were no major differences between the replies from southern and northern representatives of small-scale fisheries organizations, with all pointing to the need to take care of family, fears about the virus, and lack or shortage of personal protective equipment as the major impacts on their health and well-being. Looking into more detail into the top three, they point to all the vulnerable fishers staying at home due to being at high risk. Younger fishers also stayed more at home to take care of their children, especially if their wives worked in an industry not connected to fisheries and needed to go to work. They also feared the virus as vessels are confined spaces. Some referred to the fact that the problem was not so much at sea, but at the landing sites, where fishermen and buyers at auction come together in a space that is relatively confined. Lastly, they pointed to difficulty complying with social distancing on board of vessels and at auction sites, and the difficulty accessing personal protective equipment, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Finally, we asked them about the measures they adopted to face the crisis. Differences were observed between northern and southern representatives of organizations between their replies, with southern mentioned they had put in place changes in fishing efforts, especially change in fishing efforts. They requested national financial aid and they increased the direct selling to consumers. While in the north, they requested financial aid and also sold directly to consumers. Those were the two most given answers. Despite applying for financial aid as being one of the top important, the most adopted measure, fishers still point to difficulties accessing these funds and that the application process is very bureaucratic. One of the most successful measures was direct selling to consumers. It was a successful measure implemented both in the north and in the south, but especially in the south. There was an observed increase on online selling, fish box schemes, won more clients, and in some cases, especially in Italy, and we also saw that in Portugal, fishers went selling door to door. There was also a change in fishing effort, especially in the south. In order to match demand, fishers stopped fishing the very expensive species and started fishing less expensive species, as they didn't have a market because these go basically to the Horeca channels. In the north, fishers pointed to the fact that the rules make this difficult to happen, to change target species. Fishers also started fishing less due to the lower demand and decrease in fish prices at auction. Thank you. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I would also like to point out that although I'm presenting this work, this is a big effort from a long list of people, especially the project coordinators Sebastian Vilazante and Jose Pascual, and a long list of co-authors who have collected the information on their respective countries. I would like to finish by thanking them all, including the representative organizations who replied to the questionnaires. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for a great presentation. And we have a lot of questions coming in for you. So we'll just get you on the screen here with me. And we can start taking some questions. There we go. Hi, Cristina. So the first question is from Jennifer G. Could you explain how you addressed and collected information on the difference of impacts on women and men working in the fishing sector?
We didn't so much. That is a very interesting topic, and I would love to actually collect information about that, but we didn't specifically collected information about gender differences. I know that some, for instance, in Galicia, some of the organizations that replied were shellfish gatherers, and they are basically women, but we didn't target that much. It started as a small endeavor between me and the colleagues from Galicia. We decided actually the shellfish gatherers went, we want to see the impact. We can't sell anything. We want to see the impact. And then we contacted a few social scientists that we had in our network all over the world. Actually, this is not just a study done in Europe. It was done all over the world. And it took a huge, we never expected so many people to actually reply. It took a life of its own, and everyone started collecting information and calling people that they had the phone number. So I have a phone number of a few representatives of a few organizations. So I started collecting information, and so did lots of other colleagues all over Europe. And we started collecting a lot of information. We had a list questionnaire that we prepared immediately when the lockdown happened, but we didn't. We're analyzing the data now in more detail, and we will potentially have that. I potentially can say that to you in the future, but right now I haven't done that.
So, but you think it would be relevant data to have, and what kind of thesis could you have about what would that kind of data maybe show?
Yes, that would be it would be very important for sure, because also a lot, I'm thinking here again, I'm going to focus a bit in Galicia, because we do have organizations just with shellfish gatherers, which is completely focused on which only has women, or mostly has women, and it's a product like shellfish that did lose a market space. I mean, people stopped buying this kind of luxury seafood that you only eat in restaurants, and they were impacted in different ways from other organizations that are mostly men-oriented and fish and target different species. So there will be a gender. I think there will be definitely a gender difference in the impact on the different genders. So that would be very interesting to look into.
We have another clarifying question from Paul Thomas. Where's the limit between northern countries and southern ones on your study? So I think he's thinking about where's the border between north and south.
Okay, good question. It was a bit decided by me for the presentation. Sorry, but we're still analyzing the data. We have a lot of data collected. I did more in a cultural basis, based on in a bit of a cultural issue than anything else. But because I do know where people were interviewed. For instance, in France, I considered the ones in the Med South and the ones in the Atlantic maybe north. So, but some are obvious. But I kind of draw a line a bit like that and consider north and south.
But you would be able to provide a map with what countries were north and south.
And I'm
okay, that's good.
And also, please bear in mind, this is a very preliminary analysis, and we are working on actually analyzing the data in much more detail. So it's very preliminary. We will be writing a paper on it, and we'll analyze it in much more detail. And there, I will very clearly define the countries, what is not, what is.
Okay. Okay. We have another question from Natalie Steins. It's a long one. Would you say that small family-owned business in fisheries in general are more resilient to socioeconomic crises such as these because they are more willing to invest own money, including free labor, in keeping the business, which has often been passed over generations going? Did you get the question?
I kind of did. I think so. I have to say, it was one of the surprising and interesting things we noticed is actually how resilient small-scale fishermen were on also trying to fend for themselves. They did apply for financial aid, but immediately they started arranging ways to sell directly. Even those that were not involved in direct selling schemes, they tried to find ways to actually organize themselves in quite an interesting way. And in some fisheries, I'm Portuguese, so I can an example from Portugal. The trolling fishery almost
Cristina, I just want to stop you. Can you just? I think it's better if you sit a bit because your sound is like lagging a bit. So the more still you're able to sit, the better. I'm sorry.
A bad habit. I'm sorry. I would say, for instance, in some countries, some trolling industry actually stopped working, and small-scale fishes kind of in a certain way continue. So in a way, the fact that they are small, they have a huge family investment. Also, the investment, maybe a financial investment, is lower. It does make them slightly more resilient. Also, they don't catch the huge amounts of. They don't have such a high catch like the trawlers would have. So they have a type of catch that's more varied in species, at least in the south. So multi-fleet, multi-species, multi-gear. So more varied in species means that they can adapt easier. It also means that they probably can go and sell door to door easier than a trolling vessel would. I hope I replied to the question.
Yeah, no, I think that answers the questions. I hope so. Otherwise, Natalie, you will have to ask again. But thank you for now. Cristina, you'll stay tuned for the panel. We have one more presentation to go before we have all four of you joining for the panel. So thank you for now. And the last presentation is from Marloes Kraan from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. So we'll have Marloes' video just in a second.
The last presentation of today is mine. My name is Marloes Kraan. I'm a marine social scientist working at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. I'm also one of the co-chairs of WG Social here at PICES. In this presentation, I will present the assessment framework we are developing at WG Social, which can be helpful for quick scientific responses following a shock such as COVID-19. When it became clear that COVID-19 became a pandemic and first feedbacks were heard about the impact, we decided to come together in a meeting to share our insights. Having the working group members from many different countries in ICES territory was very useful. The first feedback reports were based on what we had heard in our countries from fishers, traders, but also from the media. And from this meeting, we realized that the impacts differed in the different cultural contexts, but also differed because the impact of the pandemic was so varied. The meeting was in April this year, and when the north of Italy was under severe and acute stress and in lockdown, in Norway, for instance, there were mostly preventive measures. We also realized that COVID-19 is an example of a shock, and that studying the impact whilst it was unfolding would be useful for industry and governments, and that having a comparative framework to do this would be very useful. Lastly, we realized that this crisis showed us how crucial it is to have baseline data readily available so that impacts can be better understood. And as WG Social, we are in the process of developing social indicators for ecosystem assessments and impact studies. So we discussed how this crisis of COVID-19 could help us prioritize our work on developing social indicators and underlying data collection. By understanding this pandemic as an example of a shock, we laid out the contours of an assessment framework. First, it would be good to understand which types of shocks there are that can impact the fishing industry, so that we could learn from research in different cases and contexts for this situation. Secondly, it's important to make a choice as to the scale of the impact that you want to assess, and look at what different or affected sectors you want to look at, so subparts of the value chain. Obviously, you need a research design and what could be the leading questions in your framework. The goal of the assessment framework is to be able to move quickly, as it helps in structuring the work and making choices, and it is also useful for comparability. COVID-19 is an example of a shock, but there are many more examples of shocks that can have an impact on the fishing industry. There can be a regime change, or more subtly, a policy change. There could be a social disaster, a natural disaster, or there could be disasters in relation to climate change. All these examples of shocks impact the fishing industry and society in different ways. They can also they can differ in terms of onset. It could be a rapid impact and also a rapid shock versus a very slowly evolving one, like climate change is an example of a slowly evolving change or shock with rapid happenings related to it. The duration can also be short-term or long-term, or as in example with COVID-19, be short-term in upsurges of the virus, but long-term in how long it stays with us. The shocks are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There could be a natural disaster being followed by a social disaster, and there could also be the possibility of cascading effects. But what is useful of making this overview, for us at least, it showed that there are examples of, for instance, hurricanes in the United States, and that the way you study the effect of a hurricane is useful in the approach of studying it for COVID-19, as Doug Lipton talked about. To study the impact of a shock requires making a choice of the level at which you want to understand the impact. Such choice impacts the research method and data availability. Again, what is interesting about COVID-19 is that it has global implications in ways that are unprecedented, and this has also become clear for its impact on fisheries. Local lockdowns in country A can impact fisheries in country B. Also, with other shocks, fisheries are affected, but trade is up and running. But now fisheries is also impacted because of trade lines being interrupted. So the pandemic has showed us how global fisheries are actually organized. Another choice to make is whether to zoom into a part of the fishing industry or to look at the whole value chain. And obviously there are different ways in which this value chain can be organized in the different countries in different contexts. And so you can focus on understanding the impact of COVID-19 on the production side and then make a choice between commercial fishing, aquaculture or subsistence fishing. Or you can look at the whole chain and the relation between production and consumption. In the case of direct sales, this is a fairly simple value chain, but obviously there can be many more steps in between. And again, in the situation of COVID-19, what was interesting is that all of these parts were impacted in different ways throughout the globe. So the processing industry has had impacts, the sales, the transport, and consumers also found themselves in different situations. What was interesting was that in some cases, and I think Cristina Pita has spoken about this, in some cases due to COVID-19, these value chains also changed. Innovations were made where there was direct sales from some small-scale fishers to consumers by using apps and web-based interfaces. The research design lays out where all the formative aspects are, such as the theoretical angle of the study, who asks for the study, how it will be used, what the scope of the study is, the methods that will and can be used depending on resources and availability of data, and the type of analysis. As social scientists, we find it important that doing such an impact study is to be theory-driven, and the concepts of resilience and vulnerability are particularly useful to understand the ability to respond to shock and return to pre-shock state or to transform to a new state based on pre-existing conditions. By using an assessment framework for shocks, it helps to see that there are certain questions that are relevant to all shock types, and we formulated 5 basic questions. First, you want to understand what is the normal situation, and ideally you have data sets that you can make use of describing what the normal situation is, but otherwise it's also something you need to sketch out. The second question obviously is what's the impact of the shock? And what are the societal impacts we're particularly interested in? The third question that is relevant to ask is, are there any compounding stressors taking place, making the impact of the shock greater or on the contrary, helping people to cope with the shock? The fourth question is, what are the implications occurring across the sectors? And these can be practical implications of IUU fishing or human rights abuse or lack of transparency, and we've seen a couple of examples of these across the world. And depending on how long these changes will last, the final question basically is, will this impact of the shock result in social transformation, or will there be a return to business as usual? So in the example of the small-scale fishermen practicing more with direct sales, will that definitely change the way they relate to consumers, or will they eventually change back to the old situation? In relation to COVID-19, there are a couple of extra questions we formulated so far. First is, for instance, how do safety measures impact across sectors? What's the implications of those safety measures for how sectors are dealing with COVID-19? Another question is, how does the level of fishing dependence affect the level of impact? And the third question we thought about was, if there is a situation of lack of transparency, does it also mean that some invisible concerns become visible due to what happened? And I think an interesting example of that is the level of payment for people working in the processing industry being quite low, making them not too resilient to deal with a shock like this. And due to COVID-19, this all of a sudden became visible. So a couple of conclusions after presenting the assessment framework that we would like to share. So the aim of the framework is that it helps in the comparability between cases. It is actually possible to compare impacts of hurricanes with impacts of COVID-19 by having such a framework. It can serve as a guide to make relevant choices in relation to scale and subsector you want to look at, or the whole value chain. It shows the importance of the socio-cultural context. So there are these different situations of value change. There are these compounding stressors that are impacting the impact of a shock. And the usefulness of having a theoretical lens. We thought that the concepts of resilience and vulnerability were particularly useful because if you want to understand how necessary certain measures are, it is also necessary to understand the resilience of people to the shock. And the final conclusion is that there is a need for social indicators and data so that we can better understand the baseline situation also on the social side. So apart from the landings and the money that is earned, understanding these factors, for instance, of people's capability to deal with shocks is also something you can translate into social indicators. That was my last slide. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Marloes, for your presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Very interesting. And we have a lot of questions coming in for you. So we're just going to take a few of those before we have the other 3 speakers join us for the panel. Okay, the sound is a bit odd here. I think it's better now. Okay, we try again. So we have a question here from Natalie Steins. In the impacts in the fisheries value chain, you only include subsectors who are involved in harvesting, processing, sales, consumptions. But there are others outside the chain who also may be affected, like fuel suppliers, etc. And then there is fisheries research that are also affected. How have you considered including these aspects as well?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think indeed the ancillary industry is important to take into account as well, and also the aspect of the impact of the relation between, I think, science and industry is interesting to mention, especially within the ICES community, because indeed not many fishery observers were able to join vessels. Also, a lot of the research cooperation that we are in the Netherlands are used to have kind of came to a standstill or at a lower pace. So there are indeed also many other aspects in relation to COVID-19 that are interesting to look at. Yeah, I think also so to discuss within the ICES community what's the impact for our fisheries data. And do we understand the fisheries data? You know, what's the COVID impact and what is maybe coming from other compounding stressors? Are good points to look at.
Great. Okay, we have another question here from Marta Ballesteros, and I really apologize to all of you participants how I pronounce your names, but I'm trying my best. And the question from Marta here is how have you tested the framework with COVID or other previous shocks? And thanks for an excellent presentation.
Well, thank you, Marta. No, it's not tested yet. It's in development basically. So I'd say any comments or feedback is welcome for us to bring it further. Colleagues of mine obviously are doing research about COVID, and when we had a meeting as WG Social, we also came together to discuss the different work types that we're doing, and that's how we realized it would be so important to have a framework so that we could better compare the work that we do.
Okay, we're just going to take one last question from Krishnan Chainai from India. And the question is, any visible impact of the lower flows of Indian farm shrimp into European markets? Would you know of that?
Not that I know
or?
of. Not that I know of, but a typical question we can maybe come back to later.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, we'll leave it for some of the other presenters. We have another one here from Pierre Pitiga. Are data missing from your assessment framework that are not in the current monitoring programs?
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of social and socioeconomic data that we would love to have that we currently don't have access to. And I think just as Doug Lipton expressed his jealousy for European data sets, I think I am jealous on the USA data sets on social indicators. So where in the USA they have fishing communities described and having social vulnerability indices readily available so that you can more quickly assess what the impact is and to what communities to look at, I don't think we have that here in Europe. So that is something I would be really interested in having.
Super. Okay. Thank you very much, Marloes. We're going to have the panel now. So for all the participants, please feel free to ask questions. It would be very nice if you, in the beginning of your question, might be able to put in the name of who are you addressing your question to. So is it for Alan, for Doug, for Marloes, or for Cristina? And maybe if it's for everybody, you can write all or not write any name. We'll just make it a bit easier for us to make sure that you get answers. But before we do that, maybe we should run a small poll just to see if you're still there on the other side of the screens. We'll just have a small poll for you before we start the panel. And the poll is done. So most of you are saying that market and supply chain would be interesting for further research. Fish stocks data and fishing trends is actually the one that's in the top. Sorry. So it seems like there's a lot of further data, further research to be made within this field. So thank you very much for participating in the poll. So please feel free to ask questions in the questions box, and also remember to use the hashtag PICES reflections if you are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and so on. So we have a few questions. Actually, we have some questions that we didn't have time to answer earlier on. So I think I'll just take a few of those, and even though the questions might be for somebody else, you feel free to jump in and also give your remarks on that. So I think the question here from Pavel Sals is, could you please tell us what specific of it you saw on the ground in terms of prices or volume of landings? And I'm pretty sure that was for Doug Lipton. So Doug, are you ready to answer that?
Actually, so I have a difficulty hearing that question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah. Could you please tell us what specific effect of COVID you saw on the ground in terms of prices or volume of landings? So I think we have difficulties with Doug's internet connection. We'll just give him a sec to see if he comes on.
I can fill time for a second while Doug hopefully comes back. I think he has a more comprehensive. He's led the U.S. effort across the country, but where I work in Alaska, we've seen real differences among different.
Yeah, but I can't hear him. Maybe he's muted, but he was just on. Doug, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, please. Okay, thank you, Alan. You can get the word afterwards. So Doug, did you get the question?
Yeah, well, is it the same question? I was just answering the question.
It's the same question.
We couldn't hear you. It cut
yeah,
off.
I wasn't able to hear you. I think the internet connection around the globe is not 5G yet, so we need maybe
okay. So I was just talking for a couple of minutes. I'm
sorry. Yeah, would you please repeat the answer? Thank you.
Yeah, I was talking about the extreme variation within the industry from, for example, oyster aquaculture, which has been a developing industry in the US in the past decade, mostly relying on live, fresh shellfish, that market, you know, basically being shut down. So that industry really feeling huge impacts, to another extreme where some of our, you know, groundfish fisheries that are, you know, processed into frozen product, not seeing much of an impact at all. So, and then everything in between. And so until we go through and, you know, quantify all of that, you know, the net effect clearly is down, you know, and what Cristina said is there's no way that the, you know, the direct sales to consumers could make up from the loss in the HoReCa sector, the hotel, restaurant, catering. There's just no way. So the aggregate impact is going to be quite large, but keeping in mind the variation between the different sectors and fisheries.
And Alan, you were ready to jump in before, so maybe you want to give us the US perspective and also maybe your perspective on the different talks you've been hearing today.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, the second Doug's, you know, he has a more comprehensive sense of this, you know, in the US, you know, but we definitely see that this real difference across different locations, and you know, depending on who, the safety issues, and people could be on boats together. And that's been actually when we went out and started talking to people in the different regions. You know, that was the first worry in many cases. You know, just how do we get our people on the boats in the right places? And in Alaska, we have had lots of quarantine concerns. I mean, I guess another point, I mean, this kind of goes to some of, Marloes's, discussion of how this is unfolding. The impacts of this are going to be felt for a long time. Like this is, we're going to keep experience. We don't know all of the companies involved that are making agreements now are, trying to deal with the uncertainty of what's going to happen to the global economy next year. So, I mean, both for big and large scale, operations, there's a lot of uncertainty that's going to continue for a long time. And I guess the question, Marloes's question of like, will we see sort of a new equilibrium of what happens where people shift into different areas? I'm sure we'll see some of that. We'll see some transitions, but that's part of what, why we're here really, is to keep studying and understanding those questions and then figure out how we can adapt our system to better handle those changes.
Cool. Okay, thank you, Alan. We have a question for you, Cristina, from Petrolino. And he's asking, is it illegal in Portugal for fishermen to sell directly to the consumer? Oh, he says it is illegal, sorry. Would this uncertain times be a good time to change that to help small-scale fisheries and communities?
Maybe. Yes, it is illegal in Portugal. So, but in parts of the Med, it is legal for small-scale fishermen to sell a part of their catch directly to consumers. So maybe this is the time that we can think about changing. We make it illegal because for counting for statistical purposes and for national insurance. So it is illegal. But there was some direct selling door to door. It was these were different times, and a few things happened that would not happen normally. But maybe it's the time to consider it.
But do you see that the fishers are asking for any changes in order to adapt to the changing situation?
The fishers that we talked from, the representatives of the organizations that did organize that way, they thought it was a good way to actually continue to go out fishing and to sell their catch. And they would like to see, most of them would like to see actually this continue into the future, especially because they are worried. They were very worried about the cancellation of seafood events over the summer, which were canceled, and that the impact that would have actually in their catch, because it's a large proportion of small-scale fisheries catch is sold in the summer in these kind of seafood events. And they were also very worried about what's coming next winter. So yes, maybe I think we can open a few exceptions and maybe think about some social change, like Marloes mentioned.
Okay,
Astrid, just to add something there, I think what we're trying to do in ICES with all of the economic and social data and analysis is to be able to understand what the impacts of a choice like that would be. So that when people make choices like that, obviously that would benefit some people, but there are people now who are the brokers to those fish who would be impacted, and that would have all these other impacts on other sectors. And so, that's our goal in all of this, is to be able to scientifically say, when policymakers consider a choice like that, to see the diverse impacts from it.
I don't know if
but Ellen, just to stay on that. Sorry, Cristina.
I was saying I don't know if it will go ahead, a measure like this, because it implies a lot of changes at the governmental level, which tends to be a bit slow. But there is some interest from some in the industry. It was very interesting to see small-scale fisheries are always portrayed as not very well organized, which they are. They don't have the capacity of large-scale fishermen to apply for financial aid. They are not so well organized, but they did organize pretty well in a time of crisis. And they were very technologically savvy. It's incredible how quickly they started selling online and creating a digital Facebook to do auction on Facebook. And so it's very interesting. And this was not observed only in Europe. We're doing this all over the world. And it was very interesting in Mexico, for instance. They started doing a lot of using digital platforms to sell their fish. So it's quite interesting to see how savvy they were and quick to respond.
Yeah, and as you also say, maybe a bit surprising, maybe not something you would expect, but that's very interesting. We have a question for you, Marloes. Do you think, from Sofia Kuhalski? So the question is, do you think the framework could be used outside of Europe? Which modification would be necessary, or do you really see it as a universal tool?
Yeah, I'd say the intention, at least, is that it is universal. I mean, the ICES area is not universal, but it's more than Europe. Yeah, so I would say so. Yeah.
Can I jump in there? When I saw Marloes's presentation and about the framework, and thinking about exactly that point, that we should be applying that across the board and get away from what we have now, which Marloes described as, oh, we've got this great social indicator data in the US, but not maybe the kind of economic data that we would like, which the Europeans have. And why is that? And if we go through this framework and we apply it, then we should have the data that we need, the ability to create baselines across the board for all the social and economic data that we would need to advise policymakers, managers, and the like.
Yeah, I think it's also, I mean, as this is a pandemic, it's such an interesting social science test case, right? It's like a huge experiment where multiple countries are responding to something that has a very diverse impact in diverse situations. So to try to see, what measures actually helped in which context and for whom and why, and who have been winners and losers, and why is that, and what are the factors that people are resilient. And I think in Cristina's presentation, the difference between the north and the south of Europe, where southern fishers were able to adapt their fishing practices, whereas in the north this was much less possible, I think is a really good example where you see that this adaptability is so crucial for people to deal with changes and with shocks. And as we think of it as a framework for many types of shocks, you can see this pandemic is not the only case, it's not the only example. And I think this flexibility and adaptability is something we really need in the future of our fisheries.
Very interesting. Okay, we have a question here from Cecilia Hammerlund. Are there any studies on fish stocks being affected by the crisis, stocks that have recovered, for example? I don't know if any of you would like to answer that.
Probably a question for the biologists at ICES. But again, it shows the variation in what the impacts might be. So stocks that are under stress from overfishing and the like might actually have a chance to recover. So there might be positive benefits. And other stocks that are tightly managed, but we're not getting up-to-date data, maybe there'll be some problems there over in the future. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It will have effects on the health of fish stocks around the world.
So we have another question around about fish stocks from Dennis Can Durgan. Do the European fishers agree on that COVID has a good impact on fish stocks, especially on shared stocks with recreational fishery?
Can I
Cristina? Yeah.
Although I will not reply to biology questions, I do think it's probably a bit premature because in general, as social scientists, we are a bit behind the natural scientists in the fisheries world. But in this kind of events, we can jump into the research much quicker because we are working with human beings and there's an immediate social economic impact. So it's actually easier to immediately see the social economic impact of something and then continue it over time than it is to actually see the biological, environmental, economic impact of something like this, that probably you will need a bit more time to be and data to be able to see something like that. I don't know. I don't know of any studies that are comparing recreational and commercial, and I also don't know of any studies that already see if there is an impact on the stocks. Okay, I'm lying. I know that CEFAS in the UK is doing. They were trying to see immediately by looking at landings per day the kind of impact of the COVID-19 on daily landings. I don't know if that reflects on actually stocks getting in a better state or not, but they were seeing the impact of daily landings, and it had decreased a lot for some species.
Super. Cristina, we haven't. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Alan, you can jump in.
I was going to say in the U.S. we track landings very carefully, and in some cases landings went down greatly, and so that will then change next year. But we've had to cancel some of our biological surveys that are where scientific ships go out and do sort of a random grid, if you're not familiar with this, and then we integrate a lot of different data to estimate fish populations. And we've tried to because we haven't had that random survey this year, we've tried to better use some of the fishing data to both understand catch and then to learn things, about the catch composition. And, this is all, of course, as everyone's talked about, people are adjusting to this dynamic environment. So you have to think about those details. And so it's been really important to have social scientists who've thought about this for a long time to inform the biological process.
Super, thank you. So, Doug, we have a question for you, and it was asked during your presentation. It's from Olivier Thiebert. Great presentation. My question is whether there are areas where you have found that the quality of data available is better than others across sectors, along the supply chain, across regions, and so on.
Yeah, great question, Olivier. And again, the familiarity that I have with the U.S. as opposed to other countries, would live in my answer to that. So Alan just alluded to the fact that, yes, we have good fisheries landings data. It's very timely. So on the harvesting sector, for the most part, we have, really good data. Actually, not so much on the aquaculture side on that, because we don't normally collect that data on a routine basis. But then as we move up the value chain in the US, our data we don't collect it as readily as often. So it becomes, difficult at the higher levels. We do usually have, processing data of some form, not as good as the harvest data. And then once the product leaves the processor and is transported throughout the US to the final consumer, we have very rough estimates. So yeah, we don't have the type of surveillance that we would really need to assess the impacts all the way through the value chain.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Doug. So we have a few, we're gonna take a few more questions from the audience, and then you will have time for some kind of like closing remark. I'm not expecting, like the big, like a big preparation for that, just so you know that you'll get the time for closing remark. So this question, it's a bit long, but I'll give it to you anyway, from Alexandra Rodriguez. Thanks to all for the presentations on capture fisheries. Could you elaborate a bit more about the about which socioeconomic data sources you're using and what methodology models you run for COVID-sensitive models to compare loss of income and profitability in relation to previous year situations. So like volume of catches, market average prices, fishing effort, and so on. So I don't know, Doug, you're looking like you can recognize the question, so maybe you should start off answering that.
Right, that sort of is what I was referring to in the scenarios. So developing a baseline, so that takes work. So in the US CARES Act, the baseline was actually defined by Congress to be a 5-year average of revenues. And then, so we calculated that for all the different fisheries. And then, now we're starting to look at the actual landings and revenues and the percentage decreases from that baseline. So, you look at a particular fishery and say between now, the beginning of the year, and, September, we're down 20% revenue, or, whatever it is for that fishery. And then what we've been doing is projecting out and saying, well, what if it remains 20% for the rest of the year? What would the losses be? Or a year from now, we're even extending our forecasts, not to the end of 2020, but to the end of 2021. And then we're also looking at a better case scenario with a quicker recovery and a worst case scenario with continued, at current levels or even worse, if we get a second wave or something like that. So that's sort of the approach we've been taking.
Cool. The sound is sometimes jumping a bit with me, but I hope it's okay. And we are trying, to cover the whole world with our internet connection. So if any of you have sound problems as well, that's how it goes sometimes. So we need to speed up a bit for the closing round. Time is running fast. There's a lot of things to dive into, and I feel that we have only scratched the surface of all the things that you guys actually know about this area. So, Cristina, if we can start with you. So what do we do when the next COVID-19 comes around, or maybe some different kind of a situation crisis that we have to adapt to? Are we ready for that?
That's a good question. And that was actually one of the things I was going to say for my closing statement, that we were caught by surprise. But how are we preparing for the upcoming months? Because the HoReCa channels which the small-scale fisheries are highly dependent on, did reopen with modifications ever so slightly, but they did reopen for the summer in most EU countries. A lot with tables outside. It will kind of close a bit over the winter because of the way it was reopened, with people having lunch outside and some tourists traveling for the summer. It will kind of close a bit. I don't think we will see what we've seen in March to May, but it will close a bit. So are we preparing enough for the next event? Because then we will not be caught by surprise anymore. So I don't know if we are preparing that much. I think I'm not so sure if we actually didn't neglect it a bit over the summer, and then we'll be again worried, very, very, very worried in October, November. So I'm not so sure. No. But it's an interesting topic to study, and I intend to continue working. We've done this study immediately after the pandemic started, but I'm already, for instance, in Portugal. I've chosen a few fisheries, or because they reacted very well, or because they did well, or because they were very highly impacted, to continue evaluating over time. And I know that the Italian colleagues also want to do it. So that will be very interesting to see the progress over time.
I need to cut you off there, Cristina. I'm so sorry, but we are running out of time. So Marloes, I just want to ask you, as a closing questions. You mentioned that some of the fishers are actually doing this digital transformation. Do you see that as a long-lasting effect, or will we be back to normal in a short while?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think, as Cristina said, it's really interesting that it's a global thing happening in many localities. I think so. That's interesting. So perhaps that's a signal of that it will stay, because yeah, we're all kind of digitalizing a lot. But I think it's also fair enough to say that it's a relatively small change and in this relatively big impact. So maybe we should also not make it as a big solution, but it has just been a really good adjustment for a couple of people, I think.
Thank you. And Alan, a short remark from you as a closing. What are we looking into now?
Well, thank you all for being here, and I think, in the SIHD you see the diversity of different social science and economic work that's being done, and we're open. If you're a social scientist who's involved in or interested in aspects of this, please reach out to us. And we want more involvement, and for stakeholders especially, we're trying to understand the policy goals. I think COVID's a good example of a shock that has hit the system. But it's a dynamic system, and we're trying to build the data and research environment so that whatever type of shock or changing trend happens, that the fishery management system will be able to better handle that. So we really want your involvement, and thanks for your interest in all the work we're doing today.
Great. Thank you. And Doc, you have a very short closing remark as well. Just want to make sure that you get the chance as well. Okay, I'll keep it brief. I'll just say that today what I learned is we can each learn from each other. So Cristina's study on small scale, Marloes on the social indicators, and the back and forth about economics and how we're doing that. We need to continue that, trading our best practices, and I think it'll help us provide better response in the future. What a great remark to end this webinar with. Thank you for all your presentations and a great discussion. Thanks to all of you for joining us today for this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm pretty sure that ICES will have more webinars to come. So please follow ICES on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook to get information on upcoming events like this. Also, please answer the survey. It will pop up after this webinar, and you'll also get an email with a link to the survey. And ICES is very interested to hear from you if you have suggestions for further webinars and events. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the day or evening. Thank you.
Thank you.